I tried all art techniques. Okay, that's a lie. But there are a lot of methods and techniques out there that are supposed to make life as an artist easier, and some of them are really underrated and others are straight up cheeks. You know how tier lists work, right? So let's do it. Hi guys, it's your favorite drawer, Marcel. I guess that's why they call me IKEA. It's because of my username. You have IKEA in the channel. Today we are ranking art techniques. We've got everything from traditional art methods to digital ones. Let's just hope that this one goes over well and isn't as divisive as my manga tier list back in the day. The only thing I want to mention before we start is that we rank methods. But some of these things are maybe even considered tips or techniques or shortcuts.
But wait, what's the difference between a technique, a method and a tip?
Exactly my point. I have no idea. So let's rank some techniques, method, tips, whatever you want to call it. LOOMIS. Probably the most famous method for drawing faces is the LOOMIS method. If you're not familiar with it, this is the technique where you draw that characteristic circle on the side of the head. What makes this method so interesting is that the entire face has been carefully measured and structured by Andrew LOOMIS in order to come up with this technique. Every single feature has a specific proportion, and personally I find it very impressive that someone out there developed such a precise and well thought out system. However, there's also some criticism of this method, because some artists draw all of their faces exactly the same by using the LOOMIS structure. Especially in Western superhero comics, this often leads to the so-called same face syndrome, which in 2026 terms is the equivalent of this meme. If you apply this method the exact same every time, that criticism is somewhat valid. But that's not actually my main issue with it, since you can always just adjust and vary these guidelines. My main criticism is that it's simply too time consuming to measure the entire face completely every single time you draw. Whether I'm drawing hundreds of manga pages or just casually sketching people on the train, I might use a few measurements, but I'm never applying the full LOOMIS method. Measuring all of this out every time would just take way too long. That being said, I still think it's great to have learned this method because it helps you understand the structure of the face much better. Ever since I learned the LOOMIS method, my portraits have improved a lot, even the ones I just scribble on the sidelines. For me, this is a solid A tier method. I think everyone should definitely learn this method by heart to draw better faces, but in my opinion, it's too time consuming to use constantly. You might know the envelope method if you've ever seen me copy something from reference. It's basically a method used to measure the proportions of a subject based on the reference image. One of the most common beginner problems is just having no idea about proportions and sizes and dimensions of the human body. So your drawings end up more like a mutant than an actual person. But with the envelope method, you first block in the overall dimensions of your drawing, almost as if you were putting the drawing inside of an envelope. From there, you gradually measure and place all of these individual parts of the body. Of course, this doesn't only work for human figures, it can also be used for objects. Personally, I've modified the method a bit for my workflow, but the idea of measuring things like this is something I can definitely recommend. That being said, this method is actually quite difficult, especially if you've never tried it before. The learning curve is pretty steep because you first have to develop a good eye for proportions, and in my opinion, proportions are something you can practice for decades and never still truly are perfect with. Still, I think this method is very underrated because it works really good. I've made a whole tutorial about it and it was very helpful for a lot of people, as you can see in this comment. Just ignore the name for fun. Well-proportioned drawing can look incredibly impressive, even if it barely has any detail. And this method helps you exactly with that. Really obvious A tier as well. Smudging is something I always associate very strongly with the amateur phase of drawing. Many people start out by smudging their drawing in some way, using a tissue or just even their finger. You might expect me to immediately throw this into last place, into D tier, but I wouldn't quite go that far. It is possible to approach it in a professional way. There are artists out there who can achieve really nice effects with this. There are even specific tools designed for this purpose, such as a blending pencil, which allows for more control. However, I still think smudging can look trashy very quickly. It's always a very thin line between looking nice and just looking very messy. Personally, I'm not a big fan of it. On top of that, you don't actually need smudging to create smooth transitions when working with pencils, colored or not. So yeah, actual C tier. All the techniques that I ranked in B tier or higher are simply methods that I personally prefer. Alright, looks like a good overview already, but man, is there still a lot of video left. I hope you enjoyed and maybe even left a like on this video so far. In order to make videos of this length, I've got a sponsor for today, which is Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning platform with thousands of classes. I've used Skillshare several times now. I've watched a lot of classes by Jake Barley and Kurzgesagt. Yes, the Kurzgesagt. And don't worry if you're not a native English speaker, because all of these classes have subtitles. So if I wanted to, I could even watch them in Spanish, Portuguese, obviously English, and most importantly, Deutsch. Just in case you wanted to ask how to edit videos like these, especially the classes by Jake Barley are priceless. All of these are industry professionals, so I literally learned animating from the best creators there are. But in case you don't care much about video editing, Skillshare obviously has classes about basically everything, be it photography or painting, art, animation, writing classes for your own stories, and so much more. And it's free for 1 month. If you're quick. The first 500 people to use my link in the info box or scan this QR code will receive a 1 month free trial of Skillshare. So be quick, click the link because it also supports the channel. Alright, then next up is another banger of an art technique. The ASARO method is another technique used for drawing faces. In this method, the face is divided into different planes or surfaces. Personally, I actually like this approach more than the LOOMIS method. You might have noticed this in shows like Arcane, how strong and defined facial features can look. That's a perfect example of the ASARO planes in action. With this method, you can essentially build a whole face by combining different planes. I like to compare it this way. The ASARO method feels like solving a jigsaw puzzle, while the LOOMIS method, with all its measurements, feels more like calculating a Sudoku. This jigsaw puzzle approach simply clicked better for me and feels easier to approach to a wide variety of faces. Whenever I draw portraits now, I almost always imagine these planes while sketching. I find it extremely useful. Of course, I don't strictly follow this method every single time. Just like with LOOMIS, I mostly borrow certain elements from it. That's why I feel it's only fair to give it the same tier as LOOMIS. The COIL technique is a method used to understand how perspective and especially foreshortening work. A lot of people already struggle with drawing basic perspective, and for that reason this method is actually pretty useful as an introduction to this. I made a tutorial about this already, and I can definitely recommend this method for people whose foreshortened poses look like someone had to break 5 bones in order to stand like that. The downside of this method, however, is that it becomes very messy very fast. With so many lines being drawn, it can be difficult to keep track of what's actually happening in your drawing. And because of that, I see it more as a learning method to understand foreshortening. On top of that, it's kinda imprecise to work this way. Other methods just get you there faster. That's why the COIL technique ends up in high C tier for me, or maybe even low B tier. It's still a good technique to actually understand this topic in the first place, which can be hard. If you've never heard about thumbnailing before, a thumbnail is basically a small plan for an artwork that you create beforehand. You make small sketches and notes about what should be in your artwork and what elements are important and so on. At first this might sound a bit unnecessary or even silly, but in reality all of my larger artworks start this way. The bigger and more complex an illustration becomes, the more things you have to keep in mind, and the more complicated things get. Thumbnailing helps a lot with that, and it's extremely useful. It has basically no downsides. And most importantly, you don't even have to be very good at drawing to do it. It's hard to imagine better conditions for something deserving an S tier. Now, the longer I draw, I feel like I'm seeing more and more professional artists who don't rely on digital effects and gimmicks as much anymore. There are even a few artists out there who draw entirely in MS Paint, without layers, effects, or anything like that. If you don't like something, well, you simply have to paint over it. I like the idea of not having to constantly think about which part of the drawing should go on which layer. These days, even for larger artworks, I usually only work with 2 or 3 layers. For me, that removes a lot of mental load because I'm constantly thinking about extra features or complicated layer setups and can simply focus on painting. That being said, I still tend to use at least 1 additional layer for the foreground and 1 for the background, so I don't actually paint everything on 1 single layer. And doing that would probably be a bit too extreme for me. Still, I do like the general idea behind it, which is why the 1 layer workflow ends up in B tier form. Remember back in school when your art teacher told you not to chicken scratch? Well, that was probably the one time in their life she was actually right. Chicken scratching is when you don't draw lines confidently and clean, but instead make lots of small sketchy strokes because you're unsure about the line you're trying to draw. This often is described as good versus bad line quality, and I've shown many times why this can be a problem. I know this technically isn't even a drawing method, or at least that's what I thought, but on some of my videos there were actually people saying they want to draw like that because they like that look. I mean, to each their own, but if you can't draw confident lines, it limits you a lot as an artist. Whether you're drawing objects or bodies or anatomy, you need clean lines. Otherwise, things like drawing in perspective can become extremely difficult later on because your lines don't clearly indicate a direction. It's basically like choosing to draw like this and make everything unnecessarily harder, when you could just be normal instead and draw like the rest of us artists. Like that. For me, this is clearly the lowest tier possible, if you could even call this a method. Cross-hatching is, in my opinion, the best shading method. One of the biggest strengths of this technique is how versatile it is. It can be used in a very simple and subtle way, but it can also become extremely detailed. You'll see it in many different styles, from manga to realistic, and it can look very clean and very structured, or loose and messy. There are really only a few basic rules you need to understand in order to cross-hatch effectively. If you want to learn it for yourself, you can check out my video about it. I briefly considered putting cross-hatching in A tier, but honestly, I don't see any disadvantages that would keep it from being S tier. Even simple cross-hatching can be learned by beginners, while masterful cross-hatching looks amazing when used by professionals. It's not rocket science, and you don't need expensive or special tools to use it. For me, it doesn't get much clearer than that when it comes to an S tier method. You might have seen that some artists don't shade with lines, but instead with dots. That technique is called pointillism, and it can look really unique. The style also strongly reminds me of tattoo art, because, well, that's how tattoos work. Personally, I love that look, and I've even tried it myself a couple of years ago. And then, never again. Why? Well, because it takes forever. For this image, I easily spent 3 times as long as if I would have just simply used lines or cross-hatching. Even when I tattooed for a brief period, this was such a pain. I have so much respect for every tattoo artist out there, because I just wouldn't have the patience. Again, I love the look, but to me it's basically a less efficient version of cross-hatching. I know I talk about this a lot on my channel. Honestly, it probably feels like half of my content is about fundamentals and constructing at this point, but that's simply because this method is so powerful. Constructing and manipulating shapes is incredibly effective. You can basically build anything with, even things like anatomy or animals can be constructed from simple shapes. In my opinion, an artwork can sometimes even look better when it's just built from really strong shapes rather than being extremely detailed. But that might be just my personal preference. Either way, a method that you could draw anything with that requires barely any knowledge to start is priceless. My subscribers would probably be disappointed if I didn't put this in S tier, considering how many exercises and videos I've made about it. And speaking of which, if you're not subscribed yet, feel free to join, become a part of the crew, become a nakama of this channel. Some drawing methods are actually quite similar. For example, pointillism is basically another version of cross-hatching. In one you darken areas with lines, in the other you do it with dots. The grid method is essentially another form of the envelope method, but in my opinion, worse. Much worse in every way. With the grid method, you divide both your reference image and your drawing into small squares and then copy the image square by square. What you're basically doing is drawing disconnected bits of lines because you can never actually look at the image as a whole. It's essentially like paint by numbers, but for drawing. With paint by numbers, you also just fill in random shapes without really learning anything about color or how the image works overall. With the envelope method, on the other hand, you actually learn how to measure things yourself. You develop an understanding of proportions and how things in the grander scheme of things fit together. The grid method feels more like a party trick if you want to copy something really quick. And even the results look shaky at best because the lines don't flow naturally across the image. For anyone who actually wants to get good at drawing, this is the absolute worst thing you could do. I already know where I'm putting the canvas flip. When you're drawing, it often happens that you simply stop noticing mistakes in your own work because you've been looking at it for so long. Usually you ask someone else to help you with feedback for finding these mistakes, but flipping the canvas is basically a way to instantly see your drawing with fresh eyes and immediately notice mistakes. Interestingly, this technique is not very modern. Long before the digital age, animators and artists would often keep a mirror next to them so they could look at their drawings flipped and spot mistakes that way. Nowadays, it's even easier. You can just use your smartphone, or even better, most drawing apps just have a simple button for it. There are so many artists out there who flip their drawings constantly, and I'm one of them if I'm drawing digitally. So that's why the canvas flip goes into S tier for me. Okay, anyone who still thinks drawing without references is better, in my opinion, is simply falling for the Dunning-Kruger effect. Once you actually become more experienced and improve as an artist, you quickly realize how valuable references are. There are countless examples for this, from Western animation at Disney to Eastern studios like MAPPA and even the most professional of artists like Boichi. All of them are using references for their work. The important thing to understand is this is not about copying something one-to-one. It's about referencing something. I've never really understood why some people criticize this. For example, how are you supposed to draw a horse if you're not allowed to look at one? On top of that, it's simply a fact that your drawings improve much faster when you look at actually the things you want to draw. References automatically make every artwork better, every professional uses them, and there are basically no downsides. Why would this not be an S tier? Now, when people first start drawing digitally, many of them feel completely lost on how to actually do anything. And I think the lasso method is a great way to deal with this. The biggest advantage is that you really only need two things: the lasso tool and a soft brush. And those two tools exist in basically every drawing app. I've often seen artists that use the lasso tool to define hard edges and then shade inside that selection with a soft brush. This allows them to create both hard and soft edges at the same time, which works surprisingly well. I've tried this myself a couple of times and it actually works just as good. What I like about this method is that you don't have to overthink things, like which brush do you use, which effects do you need, how do you apply them. You simply use two tools that every software has and you just start painting. Even though I personally don't use this technique a lot, I still think it's very recommendable, so for me, this is a solid A tier method. And if you're now like, wait, I want more tier lists, this was kind of fun. Well, I do have tier lists where I rank manga artists and another one where I rank art supplies. Be warned though, the manga one has some hot takes that are really hard to handle for some people. Well then, see you guys next time. Goodbye.